She was just an elderly woman, quietly taking her seat in first class, expecting nothing but a peaceful flight. But within minutes, a flight attendant stood over her, eyes cold, voice sharp. "You need to move. First class isn't for you." She tried to explain, holding up her ticket as proof that she belonged there. But the attendant didn't even glance at it, didn't bother to listen. 5 minutes later, the one being removed from the plane wasn't her, it was the flight attendant. In just a few moments, what should have been an ordinary flight turned into a national scandal. And by the time they landed, a career had come to an end. Annalise Carter, 65, was no stranger to flying. But today felt different. Maybe it was the excitement of finally seeing her grandson after so many years. Or perhaps it was just the weight of time settling into her bones. Either way, she was ready to board her flight, take the seat she had paid for, and enjoy a peaceful journey. She stepped up to the check-in counter, placing her ticket down. The agent, a young woman with a polite but hurried expression, quickly scanned it, nodded, and smiled. "Mrs. Carter, you're all set. First-class boarding will begin now. Enjoy your flight." A quiet sense of pride settled in Annalise's chest as she carefully tucked the ticket back into her purse. First class wasn't something she indulged in often, but this trip was special. She had spent years working, saving, making sure her family had everything they needed. Now she allowed herself this small luxury, one she had earned. Standing in the waiting area, she adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder. Around her, the terminal buzzed with life. Passengers arriving, some speaking in hushed tones, others glued to their phones. No one paid her any attention. And she didn't mind. But in just a few minutes, every eye would be on her. The minutes ticked by, and soon the boarding announcement crackled through the speakers. "First-class passengers on Flight 382 to Atlanta, you may now begin boarding." Annalise tightened her grip on the handle of her suitcase and stepped forward. A few other first-class passengers moved alongside her. Businessmen in tailored suits, a young couple whispering to each other, a woman in oversized sunglasses scrolling through her phone. No one gave her a second glance, and that suited her just fine. At the gate, she handed her ticket to the agent, who barely looked up as they scanned it. With a brief nod, they gestured toward the jet bridge. The cool rush of air greeted her as she walked through the narrow passage, the familiar scent of recycled cabin air settling around her. At the entrance, a flight attendant stood poised, her practiced smile never quite reaching her eyes. Madison Keene had spent nearly a decade in the skies, and she carried herself like she owned every inch of the cabin. She nodded at the first few passengers, polite but detached. Annalise took no particular notice of her as she stepped into the first-class section. The seat was wide, the cushioning plush beneath her as she settled in. A sigh of quiet relief escaped her lips. The past few days had been tiring, and now, finally, she could rest. She reached into her purse, fingers grazing the smooth edges of a small, worn photograph. Pulling it out, she traced her thumb over the image, her grandson Ethan as a little boy standing outside her old house, his smile beaming at the camera. It had been years since she'd last seen him in person. Soon that would change. Tucking the photo safely back inside, she allowed herself a small smile. But just as she began to relax, a sharp voice sliced through the hum of the cabin. "Excuse me, ma'am. I believe you're in the wrong seat." Annalise looked up. Standing before her was Madison Keene, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin, unimpressed line. Her uniform was pristine, her hair pulled into a tight bun, her name tag gleaming under the overhead lights. Annalise blinked, then reached for her ticket, her expression composed. "I'm quite certain this is my seat." Madison barely spared a glance before shaking her head. "First class is for paying passengers. Are you sure you weren't meant to sit in the main cabin?" The words landed heavier than they should have. Not because Annalise doubted herself, but because of the way Madison said them, like it wasn't about the ticket at all. For a brief moment, Annalise wondered if she had misheard. But then she saw it, the way Madison's gaze swept over her, not at the ticket but at her. The slight hesitation in her posture. The way her words carried something unspoken, something that had nothing to do with seating arrangements. This wasn't about a mistake. Annalise sat up straighter, her fingers pressing against the crisp edges of her ticket. Her voice was steady, calm but firm. "This is my assigned seat." Madison sighed, a flicker of impatience breaking through her otherwise controlled demeanor. Nearby passengers had started to notice, some stealing quick glances, others pretending not to hear. The flight attendant leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, though the authority in her tone remained. "Let's not make this difficult. I can help you find your real seat." A slow burn ignited in Annalise's chest. She had followed every rule. She had done nothing wrong. And yet, she was the one being told to leave a seat she rightfully belonged in. She exhaled through her nose, keeping her voice level. I'm not moving. My ticket is valid, and this is where I am supposed to be. Madison's jaw tensed, her polished composure cracking ever so slightly. She clearly hadn't expected resistance. Straightening, she tugged at the hem of her uniform as if regaining control. I'll be right back. The words were clipped, almost dismissive. Then, with a sharp turn, she strode toward the front of the plane. Annalise remained seated, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. She wasn't going to cause a scene. She didn't need to. The cabin had already shifted. The murmurs grew quieter, but the energy in the air was unmistakable, a quiet, waiting tension. The weight of every gaze, every unspoken judgment pressed against her. Passengers watched. Some in curiosity. Some in discomfort. Others quickly averted their eyes, unwilling to acknowledge what was happening. It was always the same. People saw. People knew. But no one ever spoke up. At the front of the plane, Madison's heels struck the carpet with clipped determination. She pushed past another flight attendant, barely acknowledging him. Jonas Reed, a younger crew member who had been restocking supplies in the galley, frowned at her sudden movement. Everything okay? He asked, adjusting his tie. Jonas adjusted his tie, eyeing Madison with mild curiosity. What's the issue? Madison let out a frustrated breath. There's a woman in first class who shouldn't be there. I told her to move, but she refused. Jonas's brows knitted together as he glanced past Madison's shoulder, spotting Annalise Carter, still seated, calm, unmoved. Did you check her ticket? He asked. Madison rolled her eyes, folding her arms tightly. I don't need to check it. I know a mistake when I see one. She probably switched seats with someone or... A deep voice cut through the tension. Or maybe she belongs there. Madison stiffened. Captain Reuben Vaughn had stepped out of the cockpit, his sharp blue eyes locked onto her with quiet scrutiny. He was a seasoned pilot, a man who had spent more years in the sky than some of his crew had been alive. He didn't tolerate unnecessary drama on his flights. For the first time since the encounter began, Madison felt the grip of control slipping from her hands. She straightened her posture, masking her discomfort behind professional formality. Sir, I believe there's been a seating issue. Mrs. Carter, Captain Vaughn interrupted smoothly. Madison blinked. You know her? The captain gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. I've flown her before. More than once. She's a respected customer. Jonas exhaled sharply, crossing his arms. Sounds like her ticket is legitimate, then. Madison's fingers twitched slightly. I still need to confirm. I just don't want passengers getting the wrong idea. Captain Vaughn's gaze hardened. The only wrong idea here is making a passenger feel like they don't belong. A flicker of unease crept into Madison's chest. She was used to controlling situations like this, to making quick calls and moving on without question. But under the weight of the captain's stare, something in her confidence wavered. Still, she forced a polite nod. Understood, sir. I'll handle it. Without another word, she turned and made her way back toward first class. But this time her steps weren't as steady. Annalise hadn't moved an inch when Madison returned. She simply lifted her gaze, waiting. Madison inhaled sharply. Her voice, though softer than before, still carried an edge of forced authority. I'm going to need to see your boarding pass. Annalise didn't hesitate. With quiet certainty, she reached into her purse, pulled out her crisp ticket and handed it over. Madison's eyes scanned the details. Her throat tightened. Seat 3A. First class. Confirmed. Madison's stomach twisted. She had been wrong. The realization settled over her like a heavy stone, but she refused to let it show. Years of experience had taught her how to mask discomfort, how to maintain control, even when it was slipping away. With a forced smile, she handed the ticket back. Thank you. Just making sure everything is in order. Annalise accepted it, tucking the ticket neatly back into her purse. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her expression remained composed, her posture unwavering. But in her eyes, steady, knowing, was the unspoken truth. She knew exactly what had just happened. Madison turned stiffly and walked away, her cheeks burning. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to acknowledge it. It was over. Move on. That's what she told herself. But as she moved toward the front of the plane, she failed to notice the young woman sitting just across the aisle, Celeste Navarro, phone still held discreetly in her hands. And Celeste? She wasn't the type to stay silent. She lowered her phone slightly, her heart pounding. She had seen moments like this before, quiet, fleeting instances of unfairness. People dismissed. People questioned. People made to feel as if they didn't belong. But this time it wasn't just a passing injustice. It had happened right in front of her. And now, she had the proof. Celeste glanced at Annalise, still seated with quiet grace, her hands resting gently in her lap. But there was something in the way she held herself, a stillness that spoke of experience. This wasn't new to her. Celeste felt her jaw tighten. It wasn't surprise she felt, it was frustration. She turned her gaze toward the front of the plane, where Madison had disappeared, likely convincing herself the moment had passed, that she could move forward as if nothing had happened. She was wrong. Up front, Madison stepped into the galley, pressing a hand against her forehead. She hadn't expected this. Not to be questioned. Not by the captain. Not by Jonas. Her chest felt tight. She had spent years working in first class, ensuring every detail was flawless, maintaining control over the space as if it were her own personal domain. And yet, in just a few minutes, that old woman had made her look incompetent. She needed to regain control. Straightening her uniform, she squared her shoulders, steadying herself. But no amount of professionalism could change the fact that the balance of power had just shifted, and for the first time Madison Keene wasn't the one holding it. Madison stepped back into the cabin, her gaze sweeping across the passengers. Most had returned to their books, their phones, or quiet conversations. It was done. By the time they were in the air, this would be forgotten. Or so she thought. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a flicker of movement. A passenger tapping rapidly on their phone screen. Her stomach tensed. She turned toward the source, Celeste Navarro. Madison's frown deepened as she stepped forward. "Excuse me, ma'am. What are you doing?" Celeste barely glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Just checking my messages?" Madison narrowed her eyes. Something about the way she said it felt off. "I'd appreciate it if passengers didn't record crew members during flight preparations." This time Celeste met her gaze fully. Unflinching. Calculated. "Oh," she said, her tone light but edged with something sharper. "I thought airlines encouraged passengers to document their experiences." Madison's stomach flipped. There was something deliberate about Celeste's words, something that made her uneasy. Celeste leaned back in her seat, adjusting her phone in her grip, her expression deceptively casual. "I guess it's only a problem when the experience doesn't look good, huh?" Madison's jaw tightened. She forced herself to stay composed. "Just focus on getting ready for takeoff, ma'am." With that, she turned sharply and walked away, trying to shake the discomfort creeping up her spine. But the feeling lingered. Back in the galley, she exhaled, pulling out her phone. A quick glance at the airline's customer feedback page. Her breath caught. A video. Just a few seconds long. The title made her blood run cold. "Elderly woman harassed for sitting in first class. Flight attendant doubts her ticket." And the view count? It was climbing by the second. Her grip on the phone tightened as she scrolled. Comments flooded the screen. Some questioning. Most condemning. Madison's pulse pounded in her ears. What's going on? The voice cut through the fog in her mind. Jonas. He had just finished his last check and was now watching her, one brow raised. Madison locked her screen quickly, forcing her face into a neutral mask. Nothing. Just checking something. Jonas didn't look convinced. You sure? You look like you just saw a ghost. Madison let out a sharp breath. It's fine. Let's just get this flight in the air. But even as the words left her lips, she knew nothing was fine at all. Madison had been in this job long enough to know how quickly one bad passenger experience could spiral out of control. A single complaint could cause trouble. A viral video? That was a disaster. The airline took public perception seriously, especially when social media was involved. If this continued to spread, it wouldn't just be a conversation between her and Captain Vaughn anymore. Corporate would step in. And if there was one thing Madison Keene couldn't afford, it was being on their radar for the wrong reasons. Back in first class, Celeste watched as Madison disappeared into the galley. She exhaled sharply, then turned her phone screen toward Annalise Carter. "Excuse me, ma'am, I just wanted to check in. Are you okay?" Annalise looked up, a soft, polite smile touching her lips, but there was something guarded in her eyes. "Oh, I'm fine, sweetheart. Thank you for asking." Celeste hesitated before speaking again. "I saw what happened. It wasn't right." Annalise sighed, smoothing a hand over the fabric of her dress. "It never is. But people like me, we learn how to handle it." We don't always get to argue. Sometimes, it's easier to let things go. Celeste's jaw tightened. That was exactly the problem. You shouldn't have to handle it. You shouldn't have to prove you belong. Annalise met her gaze with a knowing look, one filled with the weight of experience, of battles fought quietly, of moments just like this one that had come and gone. That's the way the world is, dear, she said gently. But that doesn't mean people don't change. Celeste leaned back in her seat, feeling the weight of Annalise's words settle over her. She admired the woman's patience, but she wasn't sure she could match it. Because as she refreshed her phone screen, her chest tightened. The video had just been shared by an airline watchdog account. And within minutes, this situation would no longer be under Madison's control. Up front, Madison swallowed hard as she tucked her phone back into her pocket. The view count was climbing. The comments were relentless. But she needed to focus. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, and she couldn't let this get worse. If she kept her head down, did her job, and acted like nothing had happened, maybe, just maybe, this would blow over. She straightened her uniform, squared her shoulders, and stepped back into first class, determined to act as if everything was normal. But the moment she entered, she felt it. The shift. The silence. Passengers who had once been absorbed in their books or phones now sat differently. More aware. More present. She could feel their eyes flicker toward her. Not outright confrontation, but an unspoken acknowledgement that something had happened, and that they had seen it. For the first time, Madison wasn't the one in control of the cabin. The cabin wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet either. There was a shift in posture, subtle movements, quiet glances. Passengers weren't openly defiant, but their bodies angled slightly toward the aisle, as if waiting for something more to unfold. Madison could feel it. Annalise Carter remained still, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She wasn't making a scene. She wasn't arguing. And yet, something about the quiet strength in the way she sat there made Madison feel unsettled. It wasn't defiance. It was something worse, a certainty that she belonged whether Madison liked it or not. And then there was Celeste. Unlike Annalise, Celeste wasn't quiet. She caught Madison's eye and tilted her head ever so slightly, her lips curling into the faintest smirk. A silent message. This isn't over. Madison looked away, clearing her throat as she forced herself to move. Focus, keep working, act normal. She turned to check on another passenger, but before she could take a step, a new voice cut through the air. Excuse me, Mississippi. Madison froze. A few rows ahead, an older gentleman had leaned slightly into the aisle. Frederick Lane. Distinguished, well-dressed, with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime in boardrooms. A man who had seen power shift from one person to another more times than he could count. Yes, sir? Madison asked, keeping her voice neutral. Frederick didn't look directly at Annalise. Instead, he gestured toward her in a way that felt deliberate, pointed. I happened to overhear what happened earlier. I was just wondering, was there an issue with this lady's ticket? Madison's spine stiffened. No, sir. Everything has been sorted. Frederick nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the armrest. I see. I fly first class all the time. I don't recall ever seeing anyone else get questioned like that. A flicker of heat rose to Madison's face. Sir, we check tickets when necessary to ensure passenger comfort and security. Frederick raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but cool. I don't doubt that. I was just wondering if it was necessary this time. The air in the cabin felt heavier. Madison clenched her jaw, forcing another polite smile. Sir, if you have any concerns about airline policies, I encourage you to file a report with customer service. Frederick chuckled lightly, shaking his head. No need for that. Seems like the internet is handling it already. Madison's breath hitched. For a split second, she felt the ground shift beneath her. But she held her composure. Please let me know if you need anything else, sir. She turned quickly, walking toward the galley before anyone else could say another word. Madison gripped the counter, her breath uneven. The weight of it all was suffocating, the whispers, the stares, the undeniable truth that this wasn't going away. The passengers weren't forgetting. They were watching. And then, her worst fear materialized. The in-flight phone rang. Her stomach twisted into knots. No one called the crew line before takeoff unless it was urgent. She hesitated for just a second, then forced herself to pick up. This is Madison Keene speaking. The voice on the other end made her blood run cold. This is Daniel Henshaw, Airline Corporate Relations. We need to have a conversation about the incident on board. Madison swallowed hard, fingers tightening around the phone. Corporate. The calm, controlled tone on the other end of the line told her there would be no excuses. No justifications. Miss Keene, we've received multiple reports regarding a situation involving a first-class passenger. Can you confirm what happened? Madison's mind raced. She could try to downplay it, frame it as a misunderstanding. But she had already seen the video spreading. Corporate had seen it too. She cleared her throat, forcing her voice into something steady. There was a brief issue with the seating confirmation, but it's been resolved. Silence. Then, a pause too long to be reassuring. That's not what we're seeing. Heat crept up Madison's neck. Sir, I was simply ensuring that all passengers were properly seated according to airline policy. Daniel's voice didn't waver. And by doing that, you singled out an elderly black woman in front of the entire first-class cabin. Her breath hitched. No sugarcoating. No buffer. Just the truth, laid out bare and undeniable. Daniel continued, his words measured but sharp. Miss Keene, do you understand the severity of this situation? Madison clenched her jaw, but she didn't respond. Because she already knew. This wasn't about one mistake. This was about the image of the airline, and she had just turned it into a crisis. Daniel's voice pressed on, unrelenting. At this very moment, we have a video circulating online with thousands of views. We have passengers on this flight who witnessed the incident firsthand. We have an internal review team already compiling reports from the captain and crew. Madison's nails dug into her palm. This wasn't going away. Madison's fingers dug into the counter. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Sir, I was only doing my job. Daniel's response was
That's exactly the
cutting.
problem.
If this is how you believe your job should be done, then we have a serious issue. The word struck like a slap. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Madison's stomach dropped. What? You will remain on board as a passenger, but you are no longer authorized to act in any capacity as a crew member. Another attendant will assume your responsibilities. When the flight lands, you will report to management for further action. Her vision blurred at the edges. This was worse than she had expected. Sir, please, This is not up for discussion. The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Captain Vaughn has already been notified. You will comply. And then, a sharp click. The line went dead. Madison stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear as if she could somehow undo what had just happened. She had worked for this airline for years. She had built her reputation on authority, efficiency, control. And now, because of one passenger, one moment, she was being stripped of it all. Slowly she turned her head. Jonas stood across the galley watching her. His expression was unreadable, but there was no sympathy in his eyes. He had heard everything. Before she could say a word, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Vaughn. We will be departing shortly. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin for takeoff. The finality in his voice made her chest tighten. Jonas stepped forward, his voice calm, firm. I'll take over from here, Madison. You should find yourself a seat. Her throat tightened. Jonas, His gaze didn't waver. It's done? And just like that, Madison Keene was no longer in control. She gripped the edge of the galley counter, her breath coming in uneven gasps as the reality settled in. She had been humiliated mid-flight, stripped of her authority in front of her own crew. And now, she had no choice but to sit among the very passengers who had just watched her fail. Jonas didn't move. I suggest you take your seat before the captain asks why you're still standing. Madison wanted to argue, to defend herself. But what defense was left? Madison wanted to insist that this was all being blown out of proportion. That it wasn't as bad as they were making it seem. That she had only been doing her job. But the weight of the moment held her back. She wasn't in charge anymore. She wasn't the one making the rules. Without another word, she turned and walked stiffly toward the first-class cabin. The moment she stepped into the aisle, she felt it. The stairs. They weren't loud. No one whispered. No one pointed. But the silence? The silence was deafening. It was a shift in power she had never experienced before, one she had spent her entire career making sure she never would. She kept her eyes forward, her breath shallow, moving quickly. But then, as she passed by Annalise Carter, the older woman lifted her gaze. There was no smugness in her expression. No satisfaction. No anger. Just quiet observation. Madison clenched her jaw and kept walking, but her pulse was erratic. She felt the weight of every gaze, Celeste, Frederick, the passengers who had watched the entire ordeal unfold. By the time she reached the front of the economy section, her skin burned with humiliation. She slid into an empty seat near the window and stared outside, but the view did nothing to steady her thoughts. For the first time since she had put on her uniform all those years ago, she felt small. Meanwhile, back in first class, Jonas approached Annalise's seat, his expression calm but undeniably serious. "Mrs. Carter, I just want to personally apologize for what happened earlier. It was unacceptable." Annalise offered a small, knowing smile. "That's very kind of you, young man. But I've been on this earth long enough to know that words are easy. Actions are harder." Jonas nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "I can promise you this, what happened won't be ignored." Celeste, still holding her phone, glanced up from her screen. "It already isn't." Jonas turned slightly, catching a glimpse of her phone. The video? It had exploded. Thousands of comments. Retweets. News outlets already picking it up. Celeste smirked, shaking her head. "Seems like the world is watching." Annalise exhaled, her gaze drifting toward the front of the plane, where Madison sat, stiff and silent in her seat. The flight had barely begun. But for Madison Keene, the turbulence had already started. The engines hummed softly as the plane began taxiing down the runway. But inside there was a different kind of tension, one that had nothing to do with takeoff. The tension in the cabin had nothing to do with turbulence. Madison sank into her seat, but the weight of it all didn't lift. This was never supposed to happen. She had always been the one with authority, the one in control, the one passengers were expected to respect, listen to, obey. Now, she was just another passenger, and she could feel it. The whispers from first class. The occasional glances from economy as people discreetly checked their phones. They all knew. The video was spreading, and she was at the center of it. She folded her arms tightly, her eyes locked on the seat back in front of her. Just get through the flight. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to fix this before it completely destroyed her career. But deep down she already knew. The damage was done. Meanwhile, back in first class, Celeste refreshed her feed. Her lips curled into a smirk as she exhaled a quiet laugh. The video? It had exploded. Multiple social media pages had picked it up. Airline watchdog accounts were already tagging the company's official page, demanding a response. She turned her phone slightly toward Annalise. "You're famous, Mrs. Carter?" Annalise chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Famous isn't what I was looking for. I just wanted to sit in the seat I paid for." Celeste nodded, understanding completely. "Well, the internet has other plans. People are angry. The airline's going to have to respond soon." As if on cue, Jonas approached again, kneeling slightly to be at Annalise's level. His voice was quiet but genuine. "Mrs. Carter, I just wanted to check. Is there anything we can do to make this flight more comfortable for you? A meal preference? A drink? Anything at all?" Annalise studied him for a moment before offering a small, knowing smile. "I appreciate it, young man. But I don't need special treatment." She paused, her voice steady. "I just wanted to be treated like everyone else." Jonas nodded slowly. The weight of her words settled deep in his chest. He had seen unfair situations play out before. Passengers ignored. Assumptions made. But rarely had he seen the tables turn so quickly. Before he could respond, a familiar voice filled the cabin. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Vaughn speaking. We've now reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. We expect a smooth flight today with minimal turbulence. In the meantime, please sit back, relax, and enjoy your journey." Jonas let out a quiet breath, knowing there was still work to do. He gave Annalise a polite nod before heading back toward the galley. As he walked away, Celeste smirked. "I bet Madison isn't relaxing right now." Annalise's lips twitched slightly. "I expect she's learning something, though." Back in economy, Madison stared blankly ahead, her fingers gripping the edge of her seatbelt. The first few minutes had been bad enough, but now she felt completely exposed. Her uniform, once a symbol of authority, control, respect, now felt like a weight pressing down on her. And then, "Excuse me, miss?" Madison turned sharply, her pulse jumping. The man beside her, a father with a young daughter resting against his arm, looked hesitant, almost apologetic. But his words cut deeper than he intended. "Aren't you supposed to be working up front?" A fresh wave of humiliation crashed over her. She forced a tight smile, shaking her head. I was reassigned. The man gave an awkward nod, sensing the tension. He quickly turned back to his daughter, clearly regretting the question. Madison exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the seat. This was going to be the longest flight of her life. Meanwhile, inside the airline's corporate office, Daniel Henshaw sat at his desk, his expression unreadable as he scrolled through the growing stack of reports. He had already watched the video twice. Each time, his expression had darkened. He turned to his assistant. Has the PR team drafted a response? The assistant nodded. They're working on it now. But honestly, sir, this isn't just an online issue anymore. She hesitated. We've got customers calling in. People are threatening to boycott. Then after a beat, and we just got a direct complaint from a VIP member. Daniel's jaw clenched. You mean Mrs. Carter? She nodded. She didn't make a big scene. Just asked for clarification on why she was singled out. But considering her loyalty to the airline, Daniel rubbed his temples. This was spiraling faster than he had anticipated. This is bad. Daniel Henshaw grabbed his phone, his fingers scrolling quickly through the internal contact list. He needed to escalate this, now. His eyes landed on the name he was looking for. Dominic Carter. Senior Vice President of Flight Operations. With a deep breath, he pressed the call button. Because now, this wasn't just Madison's problem anymore. This was about to go all the way to the top. Madison shifted in her seat, her breath uneven as the weight of it all settled deeper. The uniform she had worn with pride for nearly a decade now felt like a heavy burden. She could still hear them. The murmurs. The subtle glances passengers threw her way when they thought she wasn't looking. She wasn't used to this. Being observed. Being judged. She had always been the one with authority. The one giving instructions. The one people were supposed to listen to. Now, she was just another passenger. And she hated it. She folded her arms, gripping them tightly as her gaze flickered toward the front of the plane. Jonas had taken over her responsibilities. Moving effortlessly through first class. Checking on passengers with ease. It stung. She had been the one who ran things here. The one who made sure every detail was in order. But now, someone else had stepped in without hesitation, without struggle. And it was as if she had never been needed at all. She turned away, exhaling sharply. She just needed to get through this flight. Then she'd find a way to fix it. To explain everything when they landed. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to salvage her career. But then, her phone vibrated. She hesitated before pulling it from her pocket, a sinking feeling tightening in her stomach. One notification sat at the top of her screen. Breaking news. Airline faces backlash after passenger removed from first class over alleged discrimination. Her breath hitched. She tapped the article, her eyes skimming the text. A video circulating on social media shows a flight attendant questioning an elderly black woman's seat in first class despite her having a valid ticket. The flight attendant has since been removed from duty mid-flight, and sources say airline executives are now involved. Customers have already begun calling for an investigation. Her pulse pounded as she scrolled lower. The comments section was already flooding with reactions. And none of them were on her side. Madison's throat tightened as she continued to scroll. This is exactly why we need accountability in air travel. This woman has probably flown more times than that flight attendant has even worked. Disgusting. The fact that they pulled the FA from duty mid-flight means they know she was in the wrong. Her grip on the phone tightened, her fingers digging into the edges. It wasn't just spreading, it was exploding. She scrolled further, her breath shallow. The airline's official account was being flooded with mentions. Thousands of angry customers demanding answers, threatening boycotts. And then, her stomach dropped. A statement had been released. Her eyes darted over the words, reading them slowly, each one making the knot in her chest tighten. We take all customer concerns seriously. The incident involving a first-class passenger on Flight 382 is under immediate review. The crew member in question has been placed on leave pending further investigation. Our airline remains committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with dignity and respect. Madison's heart pounded. Placed on leave. That meant this wasn't just going to be a conversation when she landed. They weren't waiting to hear her side. They were already moving to get rid of her. She glanced around, suddenly feeling like the walls of the plane were closing in. She had seen employees get fired before, sometimes for small mistakes, sometimes for things that weren't even their fault. But this was different. Because there was video proof. And once the public got involved, the airline wouldn't hesitate to cut her loose to protect its image. She could feel her pulse in her ears, panic clawing its way up her throat. Her fingers trembled as she turned off her phone and shoved it deep into her pocket. As if that would make all of this disappear. But it wouldn't. Meanwhile, back in first class, Annalise Carter sat quietly, her hands resting gently in her lap. The plane was peaceful now. But the tension still lingered. She could feel it. The way some passengers avoided her gaze. The way others gave her small, quiet nods of acknowledgement. She wasn't sure how to feel. She had spent a lifetime experiencing moments like this, some subtle, some blatant. And all of them had left a mark. It was exhausting in its own way. She had faced moments like this before, some subtle, some blatant. But never had one played out so publicly. Never had the consequences come this quickly. Across from her, Celeste tapped at her phone before glancing up. Looks like corporate finally responded. Annalise raised an eyebrow. What did they say? Celeste smirked. They're investigating. Which basically means they're already preparing to fire her. Annalise inhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. I don't want anyone to lose their job over this. Celeste scoffed. Mrs. Carter, she was ready to throw you off this plane like you didn't belong here. She didn't even check properly before making a decision. Why should she get to keep her job? Annalise tilted her head slightly. Because people only change when they're given the chance to. Celeste hesitated. And if she doesn't change? A knowing smile touched Annalise's lips. Then she won't be getting back on another plane, will she? Celeste sighed, leaning back. You're too patient, Mrs. Carter. Annalise chuckled softly. It's not patience, dear. It's just knowing that the world will handle things how it sees fit. Her gaze drifted toward the front of the plane, where Madison sat motionless, hands clenched tightly in her lap. There was no doubt, the woman was struggling. Fearing for her career. Possibly even regretting her actions. But regret meant nothing if it didn't lead to change. As the plane continued its steady path through the sky, the world below them was already shifting. And soon, Madison Keene would have to decide which way she was going to fall. The low hum of the engines filled the cabin. But for Madison, it might as well have been silence. The weight in her chest was suffocating, like an invisible grip tightening around her throat. She shifted in her seat, fingers curled into fists in her lap. She tried to steady herself, but it didn't matter. The reality remained the same. Her career, everything she had worked for, was hanging by a thread. She stole a glance toward first class. But the curtain had already been drawn. She was cut off. From the section she had once controlled. From the passengers who had once looked to her for direction. Just an hour ago she had been in charge. Now, she was just another passenger. The very people she had always dismissed as background noise. The travelers who shuffled past her while boarding. The ones she rarely paid attention to, unless they needed something. And now, she was one of them. Her pulse jumped at the sound of footsteps approaching. Her body stiffened, bracing for the moment Jonas would return, ready to humiliate her further. But it wasn't Jonas. It was Hannah Lowell. Another flight attendant. Hannah had always been friendly, soft-spoken, efficient. She had worked in economy for years, never drawing much attention, never causing trouble. But now, as she stopped beside Madison's seat, there was something unreadable in her expression. Would you like something to drink? She asked simply. Madison blinked, caught off guard. She wasn't expecting that. Her throat felt unbearably dry. Water. Please. Hannah gave a small nod, handed her a plastic cup, then lingered for just a second. Rough day? Madison nearly scoffed at the understatement. But she swallowed it down. She didn't need pity. She didn't need kindness. What she needed was a way to fix this before it was too late. Something like that, she muttered, gripping the cup too tightly. Hannah tilted her head slightly as if weighing her words. Then finally, people are talking about it, you know. Madison's stomach twisted. I figured. Hannah nodded toward a few passengers, casually scrolling through their phones. Some of them already know your name. She let the words settle before adding. You might want to prepare yourself when we land. Madison's throat tightened. Hannah studied her for another moment before stepping back. If you need anything, let me know. And just like that, she was gone. Madison stared at the untouched water in her hands. Prepare herself? For what? for what she already knew was coming. The moment they landed, she'd be met at the gate by management, maybe even security. She'd be pulled into an office, asked to explain herself, forced to sit through an uncomfortable meeting where she'd try to justify why she had questioned Annalise Carter's seat without proper verification. And then, they'd fire her. She knew it, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter that she had worked for the airline for nearly 10 years. It didn't matter that she had followed every policy her entire career. It didn't matter that she had always been by the book, always in control, always the one making the calls. Because none of that mattered now. None of it mattered now. The years she had spent being strict with first-class passengers, enforcing rules, maintaining order, none of it mattered. Because the world had seen what she had done. And the airline? They would never choose to defend her over protecting their image. Madison exhaled sharply, finally taking a small sip of water. But it did nothing to soothe the burning in her throat. Meanwhile, in first class, Celeste refreshed her phone again, watching as the airline's page became flooded with comments. She smirked, turning to Annalise. "Looks like you're a trending topic, Mrs. Carter." Annalise sighed. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" Celeste grinned. "Maybe not. But it's proof that people are paying attention." Annalise folded her hands in her lap, watching as Jonas moved effortlessly through the cabin, continuing service as if nothing had happened. That was the thing about moments like these. People moved on quickly. The world would keep spinning. The airline would release a statement, the news cycle would shift to something else, and eventually, everyone would forget. Everyone except Madison Keene. She would carry this forever. Celeste continued scrolling, her eyes skimming over post after post. Some calling for Madison to be fired. Others demanding policy changes. Better training. Accountability. Then, something caught her eye. She paused. "Well, this is interesting." Annalise glanced over. "What is?" Celeste turned her phone slightly. Someone just posted a follow-up. Apparently the airline isn't just putting Madison on leave. They're pulling flight records to see if she's done this before. Annalise's brows lifted slightly. "So they're digging deeper." Celeste nodded. "Looks like it. If this isn't the first time she's acted like this, she's done." Annalise exhaled slowly, uncertain how she felt about that. Celeste, however, had no such reservations. "Karma's fast today." Back in economy, Madison's phone vibrated again. She hesitated. Then, slowly she pulled it out. Another notification. But this one wasn't from social media. It was from her personal email. Her breath caught when she saw the subject line. Notification of formal review, immediate response required. Her stomach turned as she tapped the email open. And there, staring back at her, were the words that sealed her fate. Under formal review by the airline's compliance board. Effective immediately, you are suspended from all flight duties pending further investigation. A meeting has been scheduled upon landing to discuss next steps. You are required to report to management upon arrival at the gate. Failure to comply may result in termination. Madison's hands trembled slightly as she read the words again. Suspended? She wasn't just removed from this flight. She was being pushed out. Her chest tightened as she realized how fast everything had crumbled. This morning she had been a senior flight attendant, moving through her routine like she always had. And now she was watching her entire career slip through her fingers. Slowly she turned off her phone and let her head fall back against the seat, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since the flight began, she felt something she wasn't used to. Powerless. Madison's breathing grew shallow, the weight of the email settling over her like a heavy blanket. Suspended? The word echoed in her mind. Louder than the hum of the engines. Louder than the murmurs of passengers scrolling through their phones. Louder than the racing thoughts she couldn't seem to control. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had spent nearly 10 years with this airline. She had been strict, yes, but she had followed the rules. First-class seats were premium. Meant for paying customers. Meant for people who belonged. Was it really so wrong that she had questioned it? But no matter how much she tried to justify it, the facts remained the same. She hadn't questioned anyone else. She hadn't even looked at Annalise Carter's ticket before assuming she was in the wrong seat. She had embarrassed a woman publicly, loudly, without giving her the basic respect she would have given any other first-class passenger. And now, She was paying for it. Madison swallowed the lump in her throat, gripping the armrest as a slight turbulence shook the plane. Normally she would have been the one walking through the aisle, reassuring passengers, making sure everyone felt safe. Now, she was just another passenger, gripping the seat, waiting for the landing. Meanwhile, in first class, Annalise Carter sipped the tea Jonas had brought her. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She wasn't one to gloat. She wasn't someone who found satisfaction in watching another person's downfall. But she did believe in consequences. "Mrs. Carter, you might want to check this." Celeste's voice was quiet but pointed as she turned her phone toward Annalise. Annalise adjusted her glasses, scanning the screen. The airline had just issued another statement, this one more serious than before. "We are conducting an internal review to ensure all passengers are treated with fairness and respect. Effective immediately, the flight attendant involved in the incident has been placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation." Celeste smirked. Indefinite suspension. That's corporate talk for, "We're waiting until people forget so we can quietly fire her." Annalise exhaled softly. "I never wanted to cost someone their job." Celeste scoffed. "Mrs. Carter, you didn't cost her anything. She did this to herself." Annalise said nothing. But deep down she knew Celeste was right. Just then Jonas approached, adjusting his tie before speaking. "I just got word from the captain. When we land, airline security will be meeting us at the gate." Annalise frowned slightly. "For what purpose?" Jonas hesitated, glancing toward where Madison was seated. "They'll be escorting Miss Keene to corporate offices for a formal hearing." Celeste leaned back, raising an eyebrow. "So they're not wasting any time." Jonas shook his head. "Not when it's already in the public eye." Annalise pursed her lips, shifting slightly in her seat. This situation had taken on a life of its own, far beyond what she had expected. She hadn't asked for this to become a spectacle. But that's exactly what it had become. Back in economy, Madison's stomach twisted as she watched Jonas speaking with Annalise. She knew exactly what was being discussed. She wasn't stupid. Her career was slipping further through her fingers with every passing minute. But, as if things couldn't get worse, another notification appeared on her phone. Her breath hitched as she read the words. "Missed call, Airline HR Department." They weren't even waiting until she landed. She stared at the screen, frozen. Madison stared at the phone, hesitating before finally tapping on the voicemail. A voice played through the speaker, calm, professional, and utterly final. "Miss Keene, this is Patricia Langley from Human Resources. We need to speak with you immediately upon landing. Please check in with your supervisor at the gate. We are also notifying your union representative regarding your suspension." Her entire body went cold. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This wasn't just an investigation. This was termination-level action. She glanced around, trying to keep her breathing steady, but she could feel it. The weight of every stare. The silent judgment in the air. She turned her head, and locked eyes with Frederick Lane, the older gentleman who had called her out earlier. To her surprise, he didn't look smug. He simply shook his head, a quiet acknowledgement that spoke volumes. "You did this to yourself?" Madison looked away, pressing her fingers against her forehead. For the first time since stepping onto this plane, she felt something new. Fear. Meanwhile, in first class, Annalise Carter fastened her seatbelt as the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are secured. We'll be landing shortly." Celeste stretched slightly, then glanced toward Annalise. "Are you ready for the circus waiting at the gate?" Annalise sighed. "I didn't ask for a circus." Celeste smirked. "Well, you got one anyway." Annalise turned to the window, watching as the city below came into view. She had spent a lifetime handling things quietly, moving with grace, never making a fuss. But today, the world had forced her into the spotlight. And for Madison Keene, her long fall from power was about to hit the ground. The plane descended smoothly, but inside the cabin, the tension was suffocating. The usual excitement passengers felt during landing was missing. Instead, there was something else. An unspoken anticipation. A quiet, collective understanding that the moment those wheels touched the ground, something was about to unfold. In economy, Madison clenched the armrest, her fingers digging into the fabric. Her breath shallowed as she swallowed against the tightness in her throat. The notification from Human Resources still lingered on her screen, its meaning unmistakable. This wasn't just the end of a flight. This was the end of everything. It felt like a ticking clock, counting down to the inevitable. The airline had already made its decision. She wasn't an employee in waiting. She was a liability they needed to eliminate. Madison's heart pounded as she thought about what was waiting for her at the gate. Would they pull her into an office, force her to sign paperwork, hand her a termination notice? Or worse, would they make a spectacle out of it? Walk her through the airport with security at her side? The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. She had worked too hard for too many years to go out like this. Her jaw clenched as she forced herself to think. She had to find a way to fight this. To convince them that this wasn't worth firing her over. But how? She had always relied on rules. On policy. On the authority her position gave her. But now, all of that had been ripped away. Now she was just another employee under review. Disposable. Meanwhile, in first class, Annalise Carter adjusted her seatbelt, her fingers grazing over the gold wedding band she still wore after all these years. She had stayed quiet for most of the flight, letting things play out the way they needed to. But deep down, she wasn't sure how she felt about what was about to happen. She had never wanted a spectacle. She had never wanted revenge. But she had also never wanted to be humiliated in front of strangers, treated like a problem that needed to be removed. She sighed softly, glancing at Celeste, who was still glued to her phone. Celeste didn't even look up as she spoke. "Well," she said, tilting the screen toward Annalise, "I hope you're ready to be on the news tonight." Annalise's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Celeste smirked. "Someone in the airport already leaked that corporate is meeting this flight. Journalists are going to be waiting at the terminal." Annalise exhaled, shaking her head. "This is getting out of control." "No," Celeste corrected, crossing her legs. "This is what happens when people don't just accept things anymore." Jonas, who had been standing near the galley, cleared his throat as he approached. "Mrs. Carter, I just wanted to thank you for your patience during all of this. I know it hasn't been easy." Annalise smiled gently. "I appreciate that, young man." Jonas hesitated before speaking again. Jonas shifted slightly before continuing. "I also wanted to let you know, Captain Vaughn was pretty upset about what happened. He's going to be filing his own report once we land." Annalise lifted a brow. "Is that so?" Jonas nodded. "He doesn't tolerate crew members who mistreat passengers. He told me himself that this is the kind of incident that makes the airline look bad, not just because of what happened but because it was preventable." Celeste chuckled. Translation: Madison just made his job harder, and now he's making sure she pays for it. Jonas sighed. "Something like that?" Annalise simply nodded. She had never been the type to demand consequences, but she believed in accountability. And for the first time, it seemed like that was actually happening. The intercom crackled to life as Captain Vaughn's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have now arrived at our destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us today." The plane taxied toward the terminal, and Madison felt like she couldn't breathe. Through the tiny window she could see them. Flashing lights. Airport security waiting near the jet bridge. And beyond that, reporters. Cameras already lifted. Microphones in hand. She was about to walk into a public relations disaster. Her mouth went dry. In first class, passengers exchanged glances, some adjusting their posture as if they too were preparing for something unusual. Celeste nudged Annalise lightly. "Ready to step off the plane as a legend?" Annalise sighed. I just want to step off as a person who got to sit in her seat. Celeste grinned. Well, too late for that. The seatbelt sign dinged off. And just like that, everything was in motion. Madison sat frozen as Jonas's voice rang through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. We ask that all passengers deplane in an orderly fashion. First-class passengers may disembark first. The first-class cabin stood immediately. Not in a rush, but with purpose. Annalise rose gracefully, lifting her purse onto her shoulder. Jonas stepped forward, offering to assist her with her carry-on. She waved him off with a warm smile. I've got it, young man. But thank you. Annalise didn't need anyone escorting her anywhere. She had walked through life on her own 2 feet, and today would be no different. As she stepped into the aisle, something unexpected happened. Frederick Lane, the businessman who had called Madison out earlier, turned to her and gave a small nod of respect. The woman with the sunglasses, the one who had stayed silent the entire flight, whispered softly. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Other passengers, the ones who had sat quietly, avoiding involvement, now looked at her differently. Not with pity, but acknowledgement. As if realizing they had witnessed something they shouldn't have ignored. Annalise didn't hold it against them. She knew. Change never started with a crowd. It started with one voice that refused to be silenced. She offered them all a gentle nod before turning toward the front of the plane. And as she stepped through the doorway, she felt it. The heat of flashing lights. The cameras waiting just outside the gate. She was no longer just a passenger. She was the moment. Behind her, Madison remained frozen in her seat. Her hands gripped the armrests as she watched Annalise disappear down the jet bridge. She wanted to run. She wanted to hide. But there was no escaping this. The world was waiting for her too. And this time, she wasn't the one giving orders. She was the one being summoned. Madison's breath felt shallow as she watched the passengers leave. Each one stepping past her without a glance. Without a second thought. She wasn't part of their world anymore. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the seat in front of her. She wasn't ready to face what was waiting beyond the plane door. Because she knew. The moment she stepped into the terminal, her life as she knew it would be over. The curtain separating first class from economy had been left open. From where she sat, she could see Jonas standing near the exit, making sure passengers disembarked smoothly. He didn't acknowledge her. Didn't look in her direction. But she knew. He was aware she was still there. The aisle was emptying fast. Soon she'd have no choice but to stand. Her fingers curled around her phone, debating. Maybe she should check it again. Maybe corporate had sent another email. Maybe. There was still some way to fix this. Madison stared at her phone, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. Maybe there was one last email. Maybe corporate had changed its mind. Maybe there was a way to undo this before it got worse. But deep down she knew the truth. There was no fixing this. She had spent years controlling the space around her, dictating how things should run, making quick judgments, enforcing rules. Rules. But now, for the first time, she was at the mercy of someone else's decision. And it terrified her. A voice broke through her thoughts. Miss Keene. She flinched slightly, looking up. Jonas stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. You need to deplane? Madison hesitated. Are they waiting for me? Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. Jonas didn't sugarcoat it. Yes. Her stomach twisted. She gripped the armrest, but her body refused to move. Jonas sighed, stepping closer. Look, I don't know what's going to happen when you step off this plane. But I do know you're making it worse by sitting here like you're a victim. Madison's head snapped up. I am a victim. This is all happening too fast. One mistake shouldn't cost me my career. Jonas stared at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled through his nose. One mistake. He let out a humorless chuckle. Madison, you didn't just misread a ticket. You didn't forget to serve a drink. You humiliated a passenger for no reason. You made an assumption and you doubled down on it, even when she gave you proof. Madison clenched her jaw. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Jonas's voice was firm. But it did. His words cut deep. Because no matter how much she wanted to deny it, he was right. Madison hated how simple he made it sound. Hated how he acted like everything was black and white. But the truth was, The world had turned against her in a matter of hours. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stand. Her legs felt unsteady as she reached for her bag. Jonas stepped aside, giving her space to move toward the exit. The closer she got to the front, the more suffocated she felt. She could hear the voices now, just beyond the door. In the terminal, the distant sound of cameras clicking. She hesitated at the threshold. Jonas? He looked at her, waiting. Her throat felt dry. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say. Maybe an excuse. Maybe an explanation. Maybe just a chance to make it all disappear. But there was nothing left to say. Jonas held her gaze for a moment, and then, he simply stepped aside. Jonas held her gaze for a moment, then simply said, "Good luck." And with that, Madison Keene took her first step off the plane. She barely had time to adjust to the brightness of the terminal before she was met with a wall of flashing lights. Murmurs. Dozens of eyes locked onto her. A cluster of reporters stood near the gate, microphones in hand. A few were already speaking into cameras, recapping the incident for the evening news. Nearby, airport security waited, their stance firm, their instructions clear. Escort her the moment she stepped out. And just a few feet away, surrounded by curious passengers and journalists, stood Annalise Carter. Madison's breath hitched. Annalise wasn't speaking to anyone. She wasn't entertaining the chaos around her. She simply stood, her posture straight, her face calm. And then she turned. Her gaze met Madison's. Madison felt frozen in place. She had expected anger, maybe satisfaction, maybe even amusement. But Annalise's expression was unreadable. And for the first time, Madison didn't know what came next, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't in control. The terminal was a storm of flashing lights, murmured conversations, phones held high, capturing the moment from every angle. Madison's chest tightened as the full weight of the situation settled over her. She had thought the plane was suffocating. But this was worse. She could feel the cameras locked onto her. The reporters edging closer, waiting for a reaction. She wanted to turn around, to step back onto the plane, to disappear before anyone could ask questions. But there was no escape now. Airport security moved first. 2 uniformed officers stepped forward. One gestured toward her bag. The other nodded toward the private corridor, leading away from the main terminal. "Miss Keene, we need you to come with us." Her mouth went dry, but she nodded stiffly. She wasn't under arrest. She knew that much. But being escorted like this, in front of cameras, in front of passengers who had once seen her as an authority figure, it was humiliating in a way she had never experienced before. Then, Annalise took a step forward. Madison's breath caught as their eyes met again. And there in Annalise's face, there was no anger. There was no anger in Annalise Carter's expression. No satisfaction. Just quiet observation. And somehow that made Madison feel even smaller than she already did. For a brief second, Madison felt the urge to say something. To defend herself. To explain. To plead for some kind of understanding. But what could she say? That it was just a mistake? That she hadn't meant for it to go this far? That she wasn't a bad person? None of it would erase what had happened. None of it would change the fact that she had humiliated Annalise. That she had dismissed her. That she had treated her like she didn't belong. And none of it would change the fact that the world had already decided she was guilty. The cameras shifted, their focus now capturing both women in the same frame. 2 people on opposite ends of the same story. Behind Annalise, Celeste muttered under her breath. "Well, this is poetic." Madison swallowed, forcing herself to move as security guided her toward the corridor. She kept her gaze forward, ignoring the voices, the clicks of cameras, the silent judgment radiating from the passengers who had just witnessed her downfall. She was almost out of sight. Just a few more steps. And then, "Miss Keene." The voice was steady. Not loud. Not angry. Just steady. Madison froze mid-step. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned, and met the gaze of the woman she had tried to remove from that plane. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Annalise simply said, "I hope you learn from this." No venom. No gloating. Just a truth that cut deeper than anything Madison had expected. Because the reality was, this moment would pass. The world would move on. The internet would find a new scandal. But Madison Keene would have to live with this forever. As she stepped into the private corridor, away from the eyes of the world, she knew. This wasn't just the end of her job. It was the end of who she used to be. The door shut behind her with a soft but final click, sealing her off from the cameras, the whispers, the silent stares that had followed her since the plane landed. She exhaled sharply, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The corridor was stark, cold, devoid of the chaos she had just stepped out of, and yet she had never felt so lost. The corridor offered no comfort, no escape. Two security personnel flanked her, their presence a silent reminder that this wasn't just a meeting. This was a verdict. Their footsteps echoed softly against the tiled floor. The silence was unbearable. Madison wanted to speak, to ask what was going to happen next, to salvage what little dignity she had left. But the words felt useless now. When they reached the office, one of the guards pushed open the door and gestured inside. "Please have a seat, Miss Keene." Madison hesitated. Her fingers clenched around the strap of her bag, knuckles white, before stepping inside. The office was small, clinical. A single desk, 2 chairs, a landline phone sitting untouched. No decoration, no warmth, just a room where bad news was delivered. She sat down, back stiff, pulse hammering in her ears. Then, the door opened again. A man in a dark navy suit stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Daniel Henshaw, Senior Director of Airline Compliance. Madison had seen him before. Mostly in corporate meetings, addressing policy updates and PR concerns. But she had never imagined she'd be sitting across from him like this. He took the seat opposite her, adjusting his cuffs before setting down a manila folder. Her name was printed on the tab. Madison swallowed. Daniel clasped his hands together, meeting her gaze. "Miss Keene, do you understand why you're here?" She nodded stiffly. "Because of what happened on the flight?" Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened the folder, scanning the top document before speaking again. "Because of what happened on the flight, and because of the way the public has responded to it?" Her stomach twisted. There it was. It wasn't just about what she had done. It was about who had seen it. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice even. "We've conducted a preliminary review of the incident, and I want to be very clear with you. This situation has escalated far beyond just a passenger complaint." Madison's nails dug into her palms. "The video of your interaction with Mrs. Carter has been viewed over 2 million times as of this morning." 2 million. She felt her breath hitch. "News outlets have already picked it up." Daniel flipped a page in the folder. "We've received over 800 formal complaints from passengers and customers." 800. Her vision blurred at the edges. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This was a public reckoning. 800 customer complaints filed against you in the last 6 hours? Madison gritted her teeth. "I didn't mean." Daniel held up a hand, cutting her off. "Miss Keene, intent is irrelevant. This is about perception. This is about what the world saw." Madison sat rigid, forcing herself to keep her expression neutral. Daniel flipped to another document. "Furthermore, we've reviewed your past flight reports. While there are no official complaints against you, we did find multiple instances of passenger discomfort due to strict enforcement of seating assignments." Madison's pulse jumped. "That's my job. I enforce policies." Daniel's gaze sharpened. "And do you enforce them equally?" Madison froze. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Daniel let the silence stretch before exhaling, closing the folder. "Here's where we stand." Madison swallowed hard. "Here it comes. Effective immediately, your employment with the airline is terminated." The words landed like a hammer. She blinked, her stomach plummeting. "You're firing me?" Daniel nodded. "We are terminating your employment on the grounds of misconduct, reputational damage to the airline, and failure to adhere to company values regarding customer treatment." Her hands clenched. "This is ridiculous. I've worked here for 10 years. I followed protocol." Daniel's expression didn't waver. "No, Miss Keene. You followed your assumptions." The silence was unbearable. Then, he reached into the folder and slid a document across the desk. "This is your official termination paperwork. We've already processed your severance package." He paused. "You'll receive your final paycheck in 2 weeks." Madison stared at the paper, her vision blurring slightly. This was real. This was happening. Daniel folded his hands. "You have the option to appeal, but given the public nature of this incident, I strongly suggest you consider whether dragging this process out will serve you any benefit. Her mouth went dry. He wasn't just firing her. He was telling her to walk away. Not just from the job. From the fight. Madison forced a slow breath, her mind scrambling for something, anything, to say that could change this. But there was nothing. She had lost. Daniel stood buttoning his suit jacket. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. Your employee access has already been revoked. And just like that, it was over. Madison didn't speak. Didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the termination papers as the last piece of her career slipped away. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she picked up the pen and signed her name. When she set it down, her hands were steady. Daniel nodded, but everything else inside her was unraveling. You're free to go, Miss Keene. Security stepped forward, waiting. Madison exhaled shakily before standing. For the last time. She walked out as a flight attendant. Her steps were slow. Her body numb. As she stepped out of the office. Past the security team. Past the uniformed employees who wouldn't even meet her eyes. She knew. There would be no coming back from this. Meanwhile, outside the airport, Annalise Carter stepped into a waiting car. She glanced out the window, watching as flashes of cameras still lingered near the terminal. She had never asked for attention. Never sought out a spectacle. But now, she was part of a conversation much bigger than herself. She sighed softly, turning her gaze toward the city beyond the airport. She had fought so many silent battles in her life. And today, for once, the world had actually listened.